Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Lucinda Rouse.
And I'm Emily Burt. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. Today we'll be discussing anti-racism in the charity sector and asking how organisations can move from making broad-brush anti-racism commitments to implementing concrete actions.
Our guest today is Joy Warmington, Chief Executive of the equalities charity Brap. Joy is also the host of a 5-part podcast series called The Quiet Revolution, which asks what happens when people stop performing anti-racism and start living it. Hello, Joy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello. Nice to see you both.
I've just stolen the tagline of your podcast there, asking what happens when we stop performing anti-racism and start living it. We're going to hear some clips from your series, but could you please just start by telling us about that distinction between performing and living anti-racism?
I think we as human beings know when we're going through the motions with something. We know when we just can't quite feel it or we just don't get it well enough. And I think that's what we're trying to convey when we're talking about performance. It's being able to feel things really deeply. It's being able to go off script. It's being able to take anti-racism and execute it in your own time, for your own purposes, for your own leadership, in your own organisation. It's not waiting for the toolkit. Often when we work in these areas, people say, is there a toolkit we can use? We know that the best type of responses come in the moment. They come through flexibility and responsiveness and engagement. So that's really what we mean by when we talk about living it. We talk about it being in you as opposed to something that you see outside of yourself.
And I think something that we see a lot of, or certainly have traditionally seen a lot of in the world of work, is people thinking more about or performing more sort of equality or equity, diversity and inclusion when they feel like they are talking about anti-racism at work. How would you say this approach of really living specifically anti-racism differs from that more traditional equity, diversity and inclusion lens?
Well, I think that equity, diversity, inclusion are versions of opportunities to try to create more equity within organisational cultures and also in terms of what they deliver outside of those cultures. And they are expressions of moments in time, actually. So as we've gone through you can tell how old I am now, as we've gone through the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, what's actually happened is that we've varied our terminology because we think diversity is going to appeal to more people. And now we think inclusion is going to appeal to even more people. And belonging is another term that I've heard. So we play about with some of these terms because we want them to be contemporary and we see the need to be able to reframe what we think and what we believe and what we want people to do with a degree of modernity. So, how do we make this fit the here and now? And as other structural marginalisation issues come on board, we want to be able to make these terms more broad and more expansive. But I suppose, unfortunately, the result of this is not necessarily about organisations behaving differently. A lot of EDIB work is to do with awareness, a bit of training, a bit of representation, but often it leaves organisations quite comfortable. It leaves them very untouched from everything else that's going on. So when we talk about anti-racism work, which is born from anti-oppressive practice, actually, so anti-racism work doesn't come out of anywhere. It comes out of this idea of, let's be anti-oppressive. Let's think about how we can do work that is more disruptive, that really begins to address some of the norms within our culture, organisations, that creates harm without us even thinking about it. So that's, I would say, the difference between those two.
So would you say then that there intrinsically has to be a greater degree of discomfort in meaningful anti-racism work as opposed to the more standard traditional EDI toolkits that organisations might be slightly more accustomed to?
I think the toolkits and a lot of the training, it can only take you so far, really. It's a little bit like my constant battle with diets. I'd like an easy diet. I'd like a diet that means I could eat anything and then lose weight. But actually, I know that that's not going to happen, that there's got to be choices that I make. There's got to be things that I clearly can't eat. I'm going to have to deny myself something. In other words, I'm going to have to be disrupted. And I think that any sort of change of this kind, this nature that we're talking about, if we are left totally unmoved and untouched by it, the chances are that we're doing exactly the same thing as we did before any of the training, before any of the intervention, before we read the toolkit, which means that we actually haven't signed up to doing anything different or new, or behaving differently, or implementing a policy or practice differently. I think you can't have it both ways. You can't say, right, we're doing EDI, we're doing really great EDI work, but actually we're left very untouched by the intervention, by the process. There has to be a level of sign up, a level of something that demands something different of you in order for you to actually deliver that kind of change.
Now, your podcast series, which came out a couple of months ago now, is 5 episodes long. One episode is particularly relevant to the voluntary sector because you interviewed the chief execs and head of diversity and inclusion of 2 major charities, UNICEF UK and Comic Relief. And I wondered if we could just play a quick clip from that episode now. We're going to hear from the chief executive of Comic Relief, Samir Patel, talking about the differences that he encountered in going into this active anti-racism work compared to some previous approaches.
In my career, I've done a lot of work around diversity and inclusion, but maybe not as much around anti-racism. And I think this is a shift probably for everyone in the industry, and everything is starting to think of it in these terms, because you move on from something that in some ways feels easier and safer. Diversity, of course, we should be more diverse. And inclusion, of course, people should feel like they belong. To suddenly anti-racism and whiteness, which is very different and does become emotional and political.
That shift Samir describes from the safety of D&I to the charged reality of anti-racism creates an immediate pressure. Because when the work gets this hard, when it starts to feel this risky, how do you keep it at the top of the agenda?
And I think that question that you posed at the end there is really pertinent. How do you ensure that as an organisation, or indeed as a sector, you continue to live and breathe a commitment to this form of work when there is so much work to be done in so many different areas? How do you ensure that this remains at the heart of what you are doing as an organisation, rather than picking up and remembering it when something really big blows up in the news?
I think that, I suppose, one of the things that I would say is that it's easy to talk about keeping these things at the top of your agenda. And I recognise the ongoing pressure that most organisations are under, not just in the charity sector, but in the public sector as well. However, if what you're trying to do is to deliver greater equity and less harm, then it's really challenging not to keep it at the top of your agenda. And I talk about harm deliberately because most people think of racism as this thing out there that just happens occasionally by a bus stop, or when you get in a park, or if there's a mob or something. What we don't realise is that it's a little bit like a dripping tap. There's ongoing harm of racism, which falls unevenly on people who are racialised as black or brown within your organisation, and other groups with racialised protected characteristics. So what that then means is that when we're working into an organisation and working on a particular issue, we often ignore that harm because we can't hold it all. We can't say, okay, when we're working in our charity and we're working with children, we're not meaning all children. We're meaning children who are from these backgrounds or from these areas, you know? And the opportunity to expand that bandwidth is not as difficult as we might think, actually. It's like a muscle that we haven't exercised. So we find it challenging because we've never really practiced that inclusion. We've not really thought, hang on a minute, when we're talking about these issues, how do we make sure that certain people don't get dropped off? And taking an anti-discriminatory lens, an anti-oppressive lens, and an anti-racist lens, although that sounds really quite complicated, it doesn't mean that you're making things harder. It's actually making things a bit easier. You know, who is less likely to benefit from this stuff? How can I make sure that the things that we do don't actually exclude or turn people off? Or so there are opportunities for greater equity when you begin to ask yourself those questions. But it's trying to work the muscle of asking those questions that I think is the bit that we find difficult to do. And it's exhausting. And I'm not expecting everybody to do it every day and every minute, because sometimes you need recovery, sometimes you need bandwidth, sometimes you need to just have a moment to think. But the more you can practice it, the more it becomes integrated, the less likely you are for it to drop off, is what I would say.
It's been a really interesting time for the charity sector in this space in the last half decade, because we had a moment. You spoke then about moments. We had a moment in 2020 where, after George Floyd was murdered in America, the charity sector woke up briefly, and many of the big household name charities, the small names, were posting Black Lives Matter, and they were posting anti-racist statements and saying, we recognize that racism is not only a massive problem in our society, but it is also structurally a part of how the voluntary sector operates. And many commitments were made to being anti-racist and to performing anti-oppressive ways of working. And I think that point about how you maintain that energy is then really important, because many statements were made. And I think that question then becomes, how do you shift from acknowledging that racism is a structural issue in the charity sector, that the foundations of charity are in many ways rooted in racist and colonial practices? So that acknowledgement is one step, but how you then create that accountability on a structural level for making sure that you are doing that work and that the work moves beyond the statement of just sort of saying it's there. What does that accountability actually look like in practice?
I think that accountability is the same accountability that many charities would say they have to the causes that they support. So most charities wouldn't say, okay, we're set up to, I don't know, work with children and support them in cancer care, but we're not doing that. People would be like, oh, you know, what are you set up for? How are you using the resources? What are you really trying to do? But with racism, and I think your question alludes to this really clearly, there's something we can get away with. And I think that's one of the reasons why it doesn't go forward as quickly as we would like. We try to get away with it because we don't understand it very well. Your point, we don't understand its systemic qualities. We don't understand how we're remaking it. In the same way, I think that if we were to just flip to things like gender, for example, I think we would have a clearer idea about what we're doing in terms of, if we just look at, you know, male and female, for an example, we would kind of get a sense of when we were promoting male interests over female interests. You know, we kind of get a bit of more of a poke around those sorts of things. But racism still appears to be something very mystic and magical, and something that we're not supposed to know about. And a part of our work as an organisation has been really helping people understand it, recognize they can learn about it, recognize that they can have some facility in it so that they can be more accountable to it. Because if you don't understand what you're more accountable for, not only do you understand what you need to do to deliver it, but you don't know whether you're succeeding. So it's like any road will get you there, and then, it doesn't actually change anything. So I think the learning bit is really important in order for people to really stand and be accountable. The fact that people haven't learned about it makes people want to shy away from it. It's a little bit like a hot potato. It's like, do we really have to do this? And you're right, there have been moments. Murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993 was another one. There have been lots of moments where we've been appalled, we've been shocked, but we've not been able to convert that into good enough understanding about systemic racism and our role within it. And without converting it, we find it hard to be accountable for it because we just don't know what it is that we're supposed to be accountable for.
And with that accountability, when it happens, there must need to be an element of reflection, evaluation, almost measurement of where have we come as an organisation in terms of acting on our commitments and action as opposed to simple acknowledgement. In the work that you do at Brap, how do you help organisations to work out how they are going to measure and evaluate the progress that they're making or lack of when they undertake this kind of work?
I think measurement is part of the solution, also part of the problem. What we measure matter. So if what we want to do is measure the amount of people in senior leadership teams from Black and Brown communities, for example, what we end up doing is we never quite achieve that measure, or the measure goes up when we appoint someone or goes down when they leave. But it's not a measure of how organisations promote equity in and of itself. It measures what an organisation might look like. It doesn't necessarily always measure what an organisation feels like to work in. I went to Canada a few years ago on a visit to Toronto, and one of the measures they had was a measure of how easily do people with similar qualifications but from different backgrounds progress through an organisation. And it was a really good opportunity for them to measure how equitable organisations were, how easy it is to rise to the top of something depending on your background. So it was a measure of culture. So we work with organisations on different types of measures. So do people who are white identifying and white presenting feel they understand issues of racism, or do they feel they spot them? Can they call them out? So, you're not just leaving this for people who are Black or brown to identify. You're recognising the whole organisation has a role in promoting equity, in understanding and challenging racism.
I think you've just identified a very common trap that organisations can often fall into once they begin on the work of trying to become an anti-oppressive, anti-racist organisation, is they can actually inadvertently end up shifting the burden of carrying out anti-racist work onto their Black, brown, or otherwise racially minoritized employees, because they assume an expertise there. So white colleagues can then almost absolve themselves from the discomfort of engaging in that work, and they will say, well, we want you to help us do this, and therefore they pass on both the practical difficulties and the emotional labor of then having to educate their colleagues around them. Whereas I think, as you're saying, there needs to be an effort across the entire organization to actually take this on.
I think it's a really useful framing, actually, that you've expressed there, because it is, in fact, what most organisations do, because they think that's the right thing to do. In the same way you'd expect people, now I'm not reducing understanding racism to understanding the fire procedures, but you'd expect everyone to know what this organisation is about, how to get out of the organisation, what to do, all of that sort of stuff. So as you said, you let people off the hook. And I think one of the ways that I would say that it was really important for organisations to really begin to break the mold in terms of just repeating the status quo is really looking at the objectives and how they deliver developmental support into their organizations. If what you're doing is a online multi-choice checklist where, you pick A, B, C, and D, how are you dealing with the contemporary issues that people have within their organizations and in terms of the delivery of services or whatever it is that they're out there trying to do? The training and development point is critical, and I think organisations don't often think well enough about that, partly because of time, partly because of money, but also because they don't really know what they don't know. And I think the other point, what do you do when people become upset? We talk about wanting to disrupt people, not because we think that's what we should be doing, but because it's an opportunity for people to think more critically about what they believe and what they do and the attitudes that they put into practice within an organisational context. However, when that results in people saying things like, well, I'm not a racist, I didn't mean to do this, da-di-da, it then lands really with a lot of heat on the other side, and organisations tend to get a bit burnt by that. I don't want my employees to be upset. I don't want people to feel burdened by this. This isn't what my intention was. And so often they can back away from something that requires more honesty and more grit to things that would be less invasive, where they can tick the box but essentially miss the point.
And just following on from that point there about the discomfort and the reticence to really lean into it, I'd like to ask you about leadership in this context. There was a very interesting point in episode 4 of your podcast around the potential personal toll on leaders who are trying to reshape and in some cases dismantle systems that actually led them to get to where they are in a position of power in the first place. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I think it comes back to the point we talked about earlier. It depends what you measure. So are you measuring how easily people are able to rise through the organisation, no matter who they are? Or are you recognising that despite your efforts, that there are patterns of who can be really senior in this organisation, who can be junior in this organisation? And those patterns may not just be racialised, there might be patterns based on gender, there might be patterns based on ability, all sorts of things. And then when you're standing on top of an organisation and you say, we want to be fair, and you might be someone who identifies as white, then if what you judge is how the organisation looks, then it doesn't look that fair. It can be like, oh my gosh, how can you be sitting here? And I have organisations that have totally white leadership teams that are doing anti-racist work. It will take time for that to seep through into the organisation's fabric and for those decisions to be made where people are promoted and rewarded justly and fairly, really. In the international sector, it's really sticky because we have the legacy of colonisation, which means that we often believe that for things to work well, it needs to be in the hands of a particular person who looks a particular way. And that challenge is not just a challenge that's met by leadership. It's a challenge that should be held by the Board of Trustees. It should be held by the whole organisation. But what I think we need to recognise is that it's not that we're saying people who are white don't have the skills to do the job that they've been appointed to. It's that other people have those skills too. And it's trying to navigate that tension. What has been denied? Who has been denied? Why have I made it? And other people who may be in similar positions and similar degrees of skills and abilities haven't made it all. So these are the really painful choice points, I think. I've been in organisations where some people have said to me, I really don't want the next CEO to be someone who looks like me. I think I would have failed if that happens.
some of the questions that you're posing there and some of the legacies that these organizations are having to deal with as well are just so vast in their scope. And this tension that you mentioned is something that you also articulated really well in the podcast episode. You talked about the messy middle, the idea that this destination you're trying to reach is sometimes very hard to actually grasp on. And it's also very, very difficult for people to really see how far they have progressed because they're still in the middle of doing that work. And it's not a linear journey either. So how do you navigate that messy middle, celebrating the steps that you are making, celebrating those granular achievements without becoming complacent about all of the progress that still needs to be made?
I believe that organisations can be places of liberation. You don't have to eat the whole elephant. But as a CEO of my own charity, I can do things, I can create culture, I can support and develop and jog people in ways that potentially I can't do outside in the world, although I would want to affect what goes outside in the world as well. So there is something that I can hold and support within the culture of my organisation, which, yeah, it has limitations because people come in with their own attitudes and belief systems, and I can't really control what goes on out there. But I can do some stuff about what goes on in here. There's something about our absoluteness as humans that can often get in the way of us feeling successful. We have to be able to hold some of this stuff. We have to be able to hold, yeah, I'm making real gains. It's being really success. And there's still racism in our organisation. Why wouldn't there be? There's racism in society as well. So there's a matter of factness that I say that with, which does not account for the hurt or harm of people that do experience racism. But there's also an energy that I hold this conversation with because I know that people are making progress. More people are understanding it. More people are making better choices in some of the organisations that we work with, and I'm sure others do as well. It is chipping away at it and recognising those successes and also having an appetite for the change that is happening now but is yet to come. I'm really optimistic about this. Race was invented, 500-600 years ago to justify this belief. If you have different people who are so-called different races, you can treat them differently. And the fact that this stuff was invented to create these ideas of inferiority and superiority means that we can, I don't know if uncreate is a word, but we can deconstruct some of that. And I'd like to think that in 500 years' time, we might not be dealing with racism in the way that we have. I'm not saying that we won't be dealing with other things as humankind, because boy, can we think of ways to hate and kill each other. We are so imaginative when it comes to that sort of stuff. But we don't have to think about racism as being the immovable, impenetrable thing that we often think it is. And I think that stops us sometimes from the energy and the hope and the appetite that it takes to challenge it.
And going back to the leadership aspect of all of this, I wonder if you have any thoughts on how leaders of organisations can be instruments rather than just sponsors of change.
Oh, I mean, you probably know from the question that people often think that that's their role as a leader, to be the figurehead of. But it means that to do more than that, you've got to use your authority in different ways. People have got to see you doing different things. People have got to see you challenging things, speaking up for things, standing with things, even though it might be uncomfortable for you to do so, and making some unpopular choices for the good of your organisation and the good of what you believe is important, which I think in some respects we do quite well in the charity sector when we're wedded to our cause. So if we can use some of that energy to stand up for issues of racism, we could make much more progress as a leader, because leaders have the ability to change outcomes and use their power differently. And just seeing people being able to do that it just makes so much difference in terms of modelling the attitudes and behaviours that are needed in organisations.
I wonder if we could just listen to one more clip from your podcast. And this time it is Philip Goodwin, who's the Chief Executive of UNICEF UK.
So you get up and say, here's the white boss sort of going, we can be really proud. And the worst thing is, I'm really proud. And people go, well, it's all very well for you to feel proud. The rest of us are suffering down here. If I can speak honestly, you're trying to say to colleagues who have done a lot of the heavy lifting on this, to say, it's okay, we've done a good job. Lots more to do, but actually just take a moment's peace or whatever, just to go, it's okay. Be proud of where you've got to. That's the bit I'm most nervous and feel personally stretched, because again, it speaks to questions of integrity as well. And I don't want to be the person who glibly sort of says, we've done very well. And people go, yeah, but you don't really know.
A lot of this depends on who's doing the celebrating, and Philip sort of said that. So often people believe they should be doing things like Black History Month and various days, etc. And I'm not saying that they're not good things to do in their own right. They can be. But you've got to hold that against a lot of the data and a lot of the experiences that tell you that we're not making as much change as we need to make. So it's that balance again. You can't really be polarised in this agenda. It's a little bit like both and. So we can celebrate our achievements and recognise that there is a lot more to do. And I think if we can be more honest and open about that, I think people would feel less marginalised. But often we celebrate achievements at the expense of people's real experiences within organisations. And that's where I think celebrations can often be very hollow and empty.
I think it comes full circle, right back to what you said at the very beginning about people performing anti-racism, but not actually living it in their organisation, making it at the core of what they do. I think particularly when organisations are going through times of pressure, there's a real risk that this work just becomes deprioritised because people feel still that it's more of a nice thing to have rather than something that actually should be at the core of every element of their work and should be at the core of their very mission itself. When people see that slide, then that's another thing that can foster those feelings of it being disingenuous work and it not being meaningful. How do you practically reframe that as something that an organisation just does alongside its general operating function at any time, even when the organisation is under pressure at all fronts, making sure that slide doesn't happen?
Great question, because we've seen that slide. It's almost like peaks and troughs, isn't it? Unfortunately, someone dies or something horrible happens and suddenly we get up and then it all slides down again. I think the first thing I would say is that this stuff is not a competition. And often people feel that when you're focusing on issues of race, then it doesn't mean you're doing gender, or it doesn't mean you're doing LGBT issues, or it doesn't mean that you're doing disability. So we're not that good at looking at structural marginalisation and taking an anti-oppressive approach, which is really what we try to do with our anti-racist work. We try to recognise that people aren't just racialised as black or brown. There's gender issues, that might be issues of poverty, which tends to be a real structural dynamic with lots of things that are actually happening within our society at the moment. So we try and encourage people to think structurally, because if you can put a ramp in, it's not just going to affect people who are wheelchair users. It's going to help me with my bad leg. It's going to help people who are older, So really trying to think about where are there opportunities to improve liberation and choice within existing organisational structures and processes, because making recruitment fairer won't just support people that look like me, it makes it fairer. And I think that's one of the problems that we have. We feel in competition all the time without recognizing there's a human being. And if we can try and think about them in their entirety and be really focused in on the kind of issues and challenges they may have because of how we perceive their identity, we can usually hit a number of points really, really quickly. And I think the other thing is we don't give ourselves enough credit. As human beings, I can hold more than one idea in my head at the same time. Usually I can do it. I mean, I don't have to just be one-dimensional. I can think about what I'm having for lunch, what I'm having for dinner, what's happening tomorrow, And we don't give ourselves as much credit to be able to hold this and to focus where we need to focus, prioritize where we need to prioritize, and then zoom out when we don't. Think really critically about where you need to be that make the most progress, and be really explicit about how you do that and how you're going to take people with you and how you're not going to deprioritize other things just because you're doing that one thing as a focus. The danger is everybody says they're going to do everything, and then of course nothing gets done because it all gets watered down because we haven't got the resources to do everything well. So your data is what I would say. Be led by where your areas of need are, where you're not doing so well, and really begin to focus in on how you improve those first.
Well, Joy, it has been so interesting to hear you speak, and you've drawn such amazing analogies. It has really made me think very differently about this topic. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you for having me, and thank you for your questions.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Joy, and you can find a link to her podcast, The Quiet Revolution, in the show notes to this episode. From all of us at Third Sector, as usual, thank you so much for listening. Our producer is Jude Owen.